So I want to welcome everybody back to Unfazed Under Fire. I'm David Kragotz. As you know, I'm your moderator and host for the show, and I'm going to welcome back today Anatoly Yakorev for another conversation on a very powerful and deep topic, which is going to be focusing on neuroscience and the power of the subconscious on achieving your aims as an executive, which is a very deep topic, but I think an important topic because a lot of people don't touch on this topic very deeply. So we thought we would dive in a little bit today. Anatoly has some expertise in this area. I've been working with it for a while, and we thought we would have a conversation about it. So I want to welcome you back, Anatoly, to the show. Appreciate your time and for this very interesting and powerful conversation. Anything you want to say at the top of the show about the power of the unconscious and why it's so important to an executive?
Well, thanks for having me again, David. Well, let's put it this way. This world today brings a host of new challenges and basically puts every executive in the line of fire where they have to deploy anything they got to put one fire after another, right? Put out one fire after another. So imagine you can no longer stay in that old shell, right? I mean, because otherwise you're gonna, crash and burn. So basically what you have to do is to make sure you can tap into any remaining potential you have in case you already ran your internal audit, you know where your strengths are, but a little extra always helps. So thanks for having this discussion, David. I think it's of critical importance these days.
Yeah, well, I think neuroscience points out that 95% of the time we're operating out of the subconscious or the unconscious, however you frame it. That a lot of times, most of our life is on autopilot. We learn, we reinforce, and then we don't have to think about it anymore. I mean, you don't have to think about how to put on your pants or how to drive your car necessarily. It's good to be aware when you're driving your car, but there's things that are autopilot in our days. We don't have to worry about, obviously digesting our food or our heart beating or our breath going in and out for the most part, and that's all run by the same system. So is that a fair assessment that when you say that here that 95% of the time we're operating off of that system, what is your explanation of that, or what is your view of that point of view on 95% of the time?
Well, let's put it this way: our critical time, starting with our early days, being a toddler and growing up. We've been affected in so many ways, growing up, right, that all of that stuff kind of went into creating the basis for our thinking and perceiving the world, right? Of course, as adults, we take it as a given. We don't know, we can't, unless we have to process some deep trauma, from those early, from our early childhood. But usually we are oblivious to that. So therefore, it may be a fair statement to say that most of it runs on autopilot. But the question is, what if most of it or some of it has some negative, influence over us in ways we don't even know? So which means that every time we're being tested with new things that kind of like, being thrown at our face, and the way we react, and speaking of being reactive, right, may not necessarily be, serve us in a way that we would like it to serve us, right? So basically, it's fair to say, but I would like to, make a small correction here, because we're talking about unconscious and subconscious minds. There is a bit of a difference between them. Mm-hmm. When we talk about our unconscious mind, it's actually our automatic reaction, resulting from what we have already, buried deeply inside of us, So where subconscious mind is still exists on that threshold without conscious awareness. So, so there is this a bit of like extra processing capacity that we can use, to make sense of what we're experiencing. So, I mean, like if we run on the unconscious mind all the time, that would be like pretty risky.
Yeah, it'd be pretty risky, right? Be zombies, basically. Right.
Well, yeah. Well, I wouldn't go that far, but but technically speaking, we would like to have a bit more control over how we regulate our life, and our emotional system as well. I mean, it's nice to have a say on that.
Yeah. So when people say that you can have an effect, do you think the effect is the effect we can have is different in the subconscious versus the unconscious? Can we have where can we have the most effect if we want to, get this? In a sense, what I'm saying, if we want to get this autopilot supporting us, or this autopilot directed in a certain way, is that a way to think about it? That there's this aspect of ourselves that's fairly uninfluenced, undirected, has been influenced. It's operating now off of a lot of autopilot now. Some of it's somewhat conscious in the subconscious area, but what can we do? So what is it? Which one of those can be most effective and supportive to us? Does it really matter?
No, well, it does matter. It does matter because if we start talking about two key components like intuition and subconscious mind, let's just distill it and talk about those two elements. Basically, most of the executives, as they operate, they rely heavily on their intuition, right? Which goes over 60% or 65% of the time, So, which means they rate it highly. Subconscious mind seems to play, almost no role there, right? Because people sometimes don't distinguish, what's the difference between intuition, subconscious mind? They sound similar, and, there can be really a lot of difference between them. However, it's very important to, yes, there is a lot of point out that there are some similarities. However, with intuition, we're talking about more of emotional processing of this information that sometimes, bypasses our cognitive, mechanisms. Because, if you look at the way intuition runs, it still has to, involve some critical parts of our brain, like the amygdala, that normally processes any threats or opportunities that arise, right? That basically people talk about fight or flight mode, right? That's our automatic response. But the difference between the intuition and the subconscious mind rests and is processed by some parts of the brain, like the anterior cingulate cortex, which combines the decision-making element, which normally is associated with the prefrontal cortex, and the emotional regulation. So this is the integration of the processing of both the emotional and cognitive information. That's right. Where the difference is made. And one more thing, there's also another part of the brain called the insula that processes, bodily sensations, and the level of emotional awareness. And that actually contributes a lot to that intuitive decision making. Now, the subconscious mind, doesn't have those two elements, but it has other things like, thalamus, this part of the brain that's deals with sensory input, sensory information that comes straight from our senses to the cortex. And another part of the brain called the hippocampus. That's basically memory information and the retrieval information and all that good stuff. But what I'm saying, it's interesting. They sound pretty much alike, but they still have some distinct features. Now, it's interesting. Executives have made peace with the intuition, but they're still fumbling around the concept of the subconscious mind because it is rather slippery.
Well, and as I was looking at, neuroscience really hasn't located an actual part of the brain where they can locate where the subconscious and the unconscious located, right? So when you're speaking about the intuition, you can point to parts of the brain that can be engaged. I mean, obviously, most executives aren't thinking about the parts of the brain. They're just looking at a way they're processing. Intuition is kind of processing partially conscious with letting it sit, letting you sleep on it, letting you, allow it to cook a little bit, as you've taken all the data in before you may make a decision if you have the luxury of that, right? And that's being processed in a certain way in parts of the brain that we understand. Is that fair to say? That the intuition, yeah. Whereas the subconscious, we can't locate locate exactly, or we haven't. We've got some guesses where it might be affecting, but we really haven't located it in the brain yet, from what I understand.
Well, some of it we can locate, certain elements that deal with ingrained habits, with it's like it basically sits in the basal ganglia part of the brain, which deals with like, breathing, heart rate, things that we
Right.
can process,
Right.
something that we don't have to think about. But
Right.
yeah, but these are just like very basic, elements of it. So far we have not been able to identify or pinpoint exact parts of the brain involved in this.
Yeah. So I guess the question becomes, if it's when it's hard to locate or find, and you can't measure it or whatever, how do we know we're influencing it? In other words, what is it? If you look at, would you say that trauma is stored still in parts of the brain? For example, we talked about trauma before. That is something that's happened. I've made a decision about, and it's kind of stuck in my brain. I might have had a bad experience with a parent, or I might have had a PTSD type of experience, or whatever. And that could be found in parts of the brain, right? That could be found where trauma is stored in parts of the brain. Is that all? Is that related to the subconscious at all?
Yeah, well, think about this. I mean, technically speaking, the way I like, everybody talks about trauma, or like, trauma-informed approach and everything. But let's look at this from a very, very basic perspective. Okay, when you're a kid, anything that happens to you, right? It could be a trauma of your life because of the way your brain is processing this, right? It could be a rebuke from your mother, it could be a slap from your father, it could be anything. But the level of emotional residue that sits there and poisons the system is huge. When we grow up, we don't think about it, right? We
Right.
never think about it. It sits somewhere in the subconscious mind. Sometimes it does rear its ugly head and reminds us in decisions we make or certain things we do. But it's a big deal because when you're a small kid, it's a big deal to you. So therefore, it creates that level of trauma. If it's left unresolved, it's going to poison the rest of your life. Even though, like, you could be very successful and very intelligent, but if it sits there and poisons your system, well, it makes sense to go back and address it,
Right.
because allowing that to continue festering and poisoning your life is not really a good idea.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah. Well, it
I
leads
mean,
to
going back to that.
leads to reactivity, reacting at the wrong times. It kind of dulls decision making. It can lead to addictions. Those kinds of things are that you don't necessarily relate directly to that trauma, but you're in a way finding ways to medicate or overcome, or every once in a while it explodes in reaction and then goes away. But all that causes problems for the executive as they're trying to run a business, right? So
Yes.
those are challenges, and so that is so that those traumas are stored in the subconscious, you would say.
Yeah, well, it's basically yes, like it's very deep, and but why is it subconscious, mind we're talking about? Because the idea is, again, some of it can come back, and as a result, when it
Yes.
comes back, we can process, right? Even at a bit of a different level or a different rate of processing, but we can still deal with it. It's not like with the unconscious mind, we have no idea where it's it, what it does, right? It does impact our behavior in ways we can't detect. Now, thanks to the subconscious mind, we can make sense of it. I mean, maybe not
Yeah.
to the extent we want, just to really like to to work it out somehow. But at least we are aware of its impact and how deep it goes.
Well,
So
and I think a lot of the trauma informed therapy that's coming out right now is sensationally based. In other words, based in some felt sense of something going on that we have to kind of slow down enough to know maybe where the reaction is before it boils up into a big reaction, and work with it, and through understanding it, through bringing it to the conscious surface, we can allow it to go through a healing process, which can take some time. But that's it. You can't talk your way out of it in most cases. Talk therapy doesn't seem to be working in the realm of trauma. It's more I have to learn how to get back in touch with that experience that I've forgotten about, that I don't even know is operating and affecting me. I have to somehow find a sense of where that came from and go to that original event and try to heal that original event, which is fundamentally, we go through these fight and flight responses, and trauma is what they say is just a stuck fight or flight response that's gotten stuck in the system. And we have to locate it somehow and feel safe enough to address it, right? To feel comfortable enough addressing it. But one of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about today was, and this might be a bit of a provocative question, because executives like to measure things and like to see where it is and like to locate it and understand data and crunch the data and be able to have some conscious ability to understand something. And if you can't find the subconscious or unconscious mind, and an executive might be suspicious about like that. Well, you can't locate it, right? Nobody's been able to measure it or actually locate it. What would you say to that as far as is this something we've made up as an explanation for our crazy behavior, or what have we done to actually locate this place that nobody can find in the brain, and how do we know it really exists other than an explanation for these reactions we have? I don't know if that's a fair question, but I thought I'd bring it up to be a little provocative in the conversation. Okay, Jung talked about the subconscious and the unconscious. Freud did. And they had those were explanations. But what would you say to somebody to say, well, those are explanations, nobody's really located
it? Well, that's really, it's a good question, because for any executive, they really want to know what the heck we're talking about, right? Because if I want to understand where the stuff comes from, I want to know. I mean, look, this is interesting because neuroscience has made amazing strides. Basically, yes. There's so much is known. But so little is available to the public, just because they don't know, they don't want to dig through some research and understand it. But it would be fair to say that at least that neuroscientists were able to identify major parts of the brain, involved, for example, with the subconscious mind, right? It's the thalamus, basal ganglia, amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and hippocampus, right? Okay, they say 5-6 basic parts of the brain have been identified. Now, but you made earlier an interesting remark. Yes, imagine that if you put a stack of slides showing where exactly our intuition or subconscious mind, sit, would that be a breakthrough for an executive to understand? Okay, there are certain parts of the brain that have been singled out to process, and maybe my behavior, my reactivity, stuff like that. At least it gives them that sense of control. Okay, I know where this stuff originates. Okay, so it would be fair to say that some of it is known, not all of it, but some of it is known enough. But we can actually look at this from a different perspective. How much is this inability to process trauma affect your everyday decision making? Okay, for example, if we're looking at the return on investment, right, and all these basic elements, how we can evaluate that, can it be evaluated or assessed? Yes. I mean, imagine you scrub, clean, and get rid of that emotional residue from your previous, years, right? And you operate from a clean slate, retaining your, productivity, your creativity, belief system, if you're happy with it, whatever. Now, what would that be? Would that be closer to some AI, operated? Because, hey, there is no emotional clutter that gets in the way. Nothing clouds your judgment. So basically, you're operating using your analytical skills, your skill set, whatever. So now, would that be, the type of mental or emotional state we would like to have to become more successful? So this is just a rhetorical question, because, right. I mean, David, imagine that we can single out that emotional clutter, right? And basically say like that negative blockage goes out. So we operate like from pure consciousness. So we're no longer being affected, by our deep-seated, ingrained habits that have been formed like, a long time ago. So we no longer have control over it. So now we operate like from a state of pure consciousness, with our subconscious mind being perfectly tuned with the level of consciousness we have. Wouldn't that be worth something to an executive?
Yes. I think so. I think it would be. And that's and so the question is, how do we get our subconscious mind in tuned in such a way, maybe not to the degree you're saying, but at least tuned in to supporting us. There's been some research done. There was a book written by Maxwell Maltz called Psychocybernetics back in the 80s, and he was a plastic surgeon that he just noticed something. He became curious because what he would notice is some of his patients who he would do this plastic surgery on would go out and their whole life would change. So they would have better relationships, get better jobs. Their level of confidence rose to new levels and new heights simply after the surgery. But what he noticed was, interestingly enough, there was also a group of patients that would go through the same plastic surgeries, have the same degree of change, and then would go out and their life would actually back into where it was before, where they had negative thoughts about themselves. They didn't really think of themselves as more attractive. In fact, they would look in the mirror and they would still see themselves as ugly. And from this work, he kind of created a set of principles. What he realized, that there was something having to do with their self-image. That their self-image was not the physical self-image. It was a subconscious or an unconscious self-image of themselves that didn't change even when the plastic surgery changed. And then he had some ideas about what to do about that. But I thought about that whole issue of how self-image is relevant and connected to the subconscious as a major sense of how we identify ourselves. And that I see in my work with my clients, a lot of times they're coming to me as an executive coach to look for tactics and strategies to be a better leader. But we all know that leadership requires something of a shift inside oneself, and a sense to change one's image of themselves into being a leader, and to connect to what you care about in your heart of hearts about why you are showing up every day at work to lead. Because leading is different than being an engineer on an engineering team, right? You're now leading a group, you're leading an organization. It's a whole different game, and it requires a different way of thinking about oneself. I don't know if you would agree with that, but what are your thoughts on that whole issue that Maltz discovered, and how this relates to one being a leader?
Well, definitely, it all starts with the level of self-leadership. Basically the kind of a stewardship that without embracing it, without doing that inner work on yourself, you can't lead others, because you're going to fall into the reactivity, all those traps, interacting with other people. It's so easy to get infected with that emotional contagion, when you're dealing with teams. Right. Somebody's negative, somebody's, too emotional and stuff like that. So a leader has absolutely no time to process so much coming at him. So therefore, he needs to be like ahead of the entire group dynamic to be able to, take informed decisions and, basically manage his team. So for him, that's definitely of critical importance to make sure he weeds out all that negative stuff that's been sown there inside of him, since early years of his life. Because if he is unable to do that, he will be stretched, taught between various members of the teams, and in numerous interactions with them, I don't think that the quality of decisions made would be positive.
Yeah. Well, and you think about, the patients that that got changed and came out and then didn't see themselves any differently, and almost a sense of, you could relate that to the imposter syndrome that many leaders deal with. Like, how did I get in this chair? Do I deserve to be in this chair? If they really knew who I was, they would kick me out of this chair. I mean, I don't think that's across the board, but there's a high percentage of executives that I run across that self-confidence and the wondering if I can keep up with this job is present. I would assess that that's happening in their subconscious as a belief they have about themselves and their self-image, and maybe trauma that's related to that, some level of emotional junk that may or may not keep them from stepping into their role as powerfully as they could. And that there's work to be done. That's why it's inner work, that you have to kind of develop a new muscle group, if you will, as a metaphor, in your way of being in a leadership role that you don't have to develop in your internal, and if you're an individual contributor role. And those muscles to me have to do with, do I have the belief in myself to stand up and communicate and be in relationship with my direct reports and with my peers and with senior leaders to move things forward in a different way than I did when I was an individual contributor, right? And there, you could have skill sets of how to communicate at those levels, but you also have to bring yourself into those conversations in a different kind of way, right?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
I mean, it's basically, let's put it this way. You brought up that in the imposter, syndrome. Well, it's mainly ascribed to the neurotic type. That usually always, that level of self-doubt and self-limiting beliefs that beset a neurotic type of a person is not that bad, by the way, because they tend to do a lot more. They tend to be perfectionists and all that. They're only to the detriment to their own, physical, well-being, because they try too hard to make sure that everybody's happy, the work is done, and all that. It doesn't make them, poor leaders or worse leaders than anybody else who are, like, for example, extroverts, or who are narcissists, or, basically it's just something that they have to deal with, early on, to make sure they operate without, spending too much energy on, overdoing things.
Right. Well, again, and then you're pointing back to the inside out. If somebody doesn't resolve those internal issues, it's almost like they're carrying a rucksack behind them, dragging it along. They may have good moments when they're clear and they're confident, and moments when they're not. That, and you're saying, you would say that the highest percentage. Would you say the highest percentage of the leadership population is in that the more neurotic area, where they're trying to do their best, they're trying to be perfectionists? Would you see the highest percentage of executives in that area?
Well, it's a good question, because I think, if you think about, like, who gets the attention of the board or other people who make decisions about promoting someone. So we're definitely talking about maybe a population of people who are extroverts, or, with a varying degree of narcissistic syndrome, because, they can always put on a good show, right, to make sure that they're the ones selected. Now, people who are basically, could be related to the neurotypical, spectrum. They are trying too hard. They're working too hard. Sometimes they may not even get selected for certain roles just because they internalize so much, but the quality of the work that they're never satisfied with what they do. So that makes them, invaluable contributors inside teams. So when you talk about the population of executives or people in leadership positions, yes, the percentage of neurotypical people is not too high. I would still put it like, it's maybe 35, maybe around 40%. With very neurotypical, you mean neurotypical? Yes, yeah. Well, because sometimes when you talk about varying degree of people who are extroverted, you may get a varying degree of what traits they have on top of that, And again, if you start looking at how certain individuals, when they get to leadership, leading roles and leadership positions, how they become, how would I put that? Sometimes they still continue doing too much work,
Yeah.
where they
Yeah.
should have shifted gears and focus on the big picture, reallocation of their resources and stuff like that. So that just adds, more challenge to their busy
Pressure.
workload. Yes, and pressure. Yes.
Well, I mean, I've seen some statistics that sociopathic and psychopathic and narcissistic personalities are 20+% of the executive pool. I mean, I don't know if narcissists are included in that, but certainly sociopaths, psychopaths are included in that. And you see that, as you say, boards and senior leaders in organizations want to pick people that are going to drive forward the outcomes they want. And those people that are in neuroatypical realms, we're not going to spend a lot of time on that today, but it's just a selection process that you see that many boards prefer, or at least are enamored and impressed by. They're not realizing the toxic trail that these people leave and the toxic nature of the cultures that they create, but they're enamored by the potentiality of this person that says, that impresses them and seems to have complete full confidence, is very charming and knows their way around a room and being able to talk about things. But at the end of the day, as we know, for example, narcissists don't tend to get a lot done, not as much done. They tend to throw it up on their people, and when things don't go well, they point the finger the other way, right? So and that the people you're speaking about that tend to do the work, the hard work, tend to not be as identified as leaders, right? Or as leaders that I'd want to put in place in that way.
Well, they definitely don't have that, proclivity to talk too much about their achievements, right? Just because they've
Right.
done all the hard work, they just don't feel the need to project or maybe sell their achievements, to the a higher bidder out there, who's talking to them. So that's unfortunately, something that, these days sets the tone in so many organizations, because you've got that pie, with the crust and the upper layer represented by people with varying degrees of certain, negative tendencies, whereas the actual amount of work is being done by people who really, work at it like very diligently, just because it's
Right.
part of their nature. So,
Right.
so therefore, we're talking about this. You're making a good point. So those people that may lack, let's say, from the neurotypical spectrum, if they lack self-confidence, right, they have self-doubts, they have limiting beliefs and all that, but they actually constitute the healthy core of leadership.
Yes.
Now, what
Yes.
if they're given a chance to flush out all that stuff that sort of like is eating them inside out and is replaced with a bit of a healthier psyche, and that helps them, run things completely unperturbed by whatever inner, conversations they may be having, about their own success or whatever they're doing. Now, can you imagine if this type of leaders is actually elevated, and they shine brightly just because they have managed to address their inner
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah.
So,
I would say that, what you're pointing to is like, is those people. It's a lot easier in my experience. In fact, to deal with somebody that has a low level of confidence. Oh, but not low level. They have lower level than maybe a narcissistic leader, certainly, or a leader that may be at least extroverted in a certain way. But it's a lot easier to deal with that, rising that up, than it is to break the other one down. Right?
that's right.
So, right, you realize, in fact, it's impossible in certain cases to break the other one down. There's so many defense mechanisms in the individual that it's very difficult. But the one that really wants to do a good job and their heart's in it, They just have to discover that strength in themselves that they haven't discovered yet, or to heal something. So I think so far in the process, and I want to move in a new direction here as we kind of, move in the last quarter of the podcast today. We've talked about the subconscious and how it can basically it's a bit of a landmine. You have to learn how to walk, to heal, to develop, to kind of smooth out some things that you may have taken on that have caused reactivity or negative self-doubt or limiting beliefs. So that's one side of it, which is part of the process of the work that we do, for sure. The other part of the process is how to, and then also we've touched on selection, and I think we just touched on it, whereas organizations have to really begin to look at how they're selecting executives that are going into the executive ranks a little differently, to not be so impressed by by the charm of the narcissist or the sociopath, and be a little bit more astute to the one that's working their butt off and making things happen, that needs some development. But that development is a lot easier than breaking down the other, as we said. So that's another area that I think this subconscious area relates to, is the neurotypical versus neuroatypical ways that we operate. But the other side of it is, it goes back to Maltz's work, where he said really learning how to tap in and leverage and utilize and build alignment between your subconscious and your conscious mind, and that can empower you to produce great outcomes. Because I think Maltz talked about the conscious mind being the steerman of the ship. It can make the decision where I want to go, but it's not the one that's going to, that willpower of that part of you is only going to take you so far in accomplishing it. You somehow have to influence the subconscious to join you on the journey, who does all the heavy lifting. And I've seen, where he would talk about you have to influence that part of you, that deeper part of you, which is typically influenced through visual stimulation and emotional stimulation, to join you in your goals, if you will. And there's been a lot of work that's been done by a lot of people, and maybe we can talk about this in the self-help industry, that have kind of tapped into some of this and utilize this as a way that if you do your vision boards, and if you really do your affirmations, and if you really work really hard, you can get the subconscious working with you. And when that happens, amazing things can happen. The subconscious mind could take you to a meeting, or it knows you're going to meet somebody that's going to connect you in your network to a new possibility, as an example. It can operate in many different ways to support you in your decision making and your interactions with others, and deciding what to do, when to do it, and to bringing opportunities to you, in a sense. And I wanted to see what your thoughts are on what do we have to do to really influence the subconscious mind in the right way to support us to reduce the effort we have to make to get things done, and make it easier for us to accomplish our visions.
Well, yes, you have covered a lot of ground. It's really interesting, because we started talking about everybody knows about intuition, so we don't have to spend much time talking about it. But the subconscious mind deserves a lot more attention for certain things I will, point out just in a second. I want to go back to originally you did mention, Sigmund Freud, right? Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because it all starts with him, the way he looked at the psyche and how he divided the psyche to have the unconscious, the preconscious, and the conscious elements. But I still tend to side with Carl Jung, who was talking about a bit of a different way of looking at the psyche, having the ego, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. And this is where the beauty, this is where the diamond in the rough resides. Because we talked about the role of the trauma, how it can affect our behavior and decision making. But imagine for a second that trauma is addressed and all the related, clutter is removed, all that negative blockage is done with. Now, there's one element that Carl Jung, pointed out to, that there is such a thing as a collective unconscious. Okay, imagine that once you get cleared of that, clutter, and suddenly you're able to tap into that level of human unconscious out there that can help and serve you in your decision making process. It's like there are multiple patterns out there. It's almost like you're connecting to your invisible advisor, right? So
Mm-hmm.
this is interesting. This is that diamond in the rough that everybody overlooks. Everybody talks about it like, okay, it's a nice story, but it doesn't really have a lot for us to chew on because we don't know. This sounds more like a myth, but the idea behind it is still very strong because the moment, and again, it always gets down to removing all the traumatic events we've ever experienced. And then as we free up, it's like on the hard drive, as we free up some
Right.
space, that also makes us, a lot more productive just because, you've heard from people whose levels of energy, go up right away and stay pretty much high. It's almost that extra energy gets available for you.
Right.
Isn't that worth something? Just that
Yeah.
tiny sliver of that. So now it's interesting. Yes, you're absolutely right. Now, uh, yes, there are different ways to address that. There could be, decades of meditative, experiences or mindfulness and this and that. But we understand that, very tiny percentage of executives, would be ready to dedicate uh, their free time to that level of self-development. Now, you did mention interesting. You talked about vision boards and affirmations and all that. That a huge industry out there, says that hey, it can really make things rock for you. Well, unfortunately, there are so many ifs. Yes, now it
Yeah.
can work for you if you have dealt with your trauma.
Yeah, well, I will tell you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will. I will say that that's true. I mean, I was down a path of studying all this and working on this, and I would say that there is a truth to the matter of how you're influencing a part of you that's processing all the time, and if that part of you becomes in the same level of positivity that you need it to be for you to you no longer have the same limitations of producing outcomes. That's true. But for me, the issue of just going into that ground and going to like a Tony Robbins event or going to an event where you learn how to do a vision board, where there is some validity in all those methods, if you are encumbered by a wet blanket of trauma within you, it is pretty much fighting up an uphill battle. In a sense, once that, what I've recognized, and through the, doing the reset with you, what I've recognized is once the wet blanket's removed, the natural creative juices begin to bubble anyway. And there's something about all that stuff that you've longed to do becomes almost automatically activated in a way. And now I might even there might be value in doing a vision board or doing something like that as a way of activating it, but it's not necessary because the natural energy and inspiration and creativity is bubbling forward after the healing, and your natural abilities come forward too without you doubting them. So it's almost like it just makes everything. And then what I start seeing more and more is life kind of operates on a positive autopilot. Not an autopilot like I'm not conscious of what's going on, but I bring myself into my day, and I just kind of intuitively know what to focus on and do. And then I also have moments where I can't help myself. I have to be creative. So I'll spend time thinking about processing, creating something new that was spontaneously came to me. So it's interesting how much even after we do we talked about the healing part. Now we're talking about this kind of framework that Maltz had, for example, or Robbins has, or all these people have that have studied this stuff and now are out there teaching it. But they're not telling you the underlying other side of it, which is this won't really work very well unless you take care of your underlying debilitating beliefs that limit you from believing that you can actually do this stuff, right?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Because we don't know, like in the case we're dealing with the unconscious mind, we don't know what it's doing to us, right? For example, we could be doing X, but our unconscious mind could be undermining our efforts without us even knowing it, right? So,
Right.
so that's why the value of addressing the trauma issues is paramount, because it has such a tremendous effect on anything we do. And, the reason those people out there are not talking about it, because no one has found an effective way of undoing trauma, that would be done, very quickly without having to do things, and stuff like that. So, but you're right, that trauma sits and blocks your way to unlock your potential, all your abilities, all your great stuff that make you shine. And, okay, any way you look at it, it just blocks and sabotages everything. So, definitely, it's not an overstatement to say that that needs to be addressed, so that a person could be completely equipped with on anything that's innate, or any potential that he has ever had, that's going to come to the fore, and he would be most productive.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so, in covering what we did today, I mean, we looked at this whole area of the subconscious and how powerful it is, and how, if the whole idea is that, if from a point of view of developing leadership, if you get your subconscious in sync with your capacity to lead, they go almost hand in hand, because if we're talking about leadership being an inside out game, the healing process is as important, what we're saying at the end of this, as it is framing how you want to lead, or framing what your priorities are, or working with your boss to figure out how we're working together to get things done. That all is important, absolutely valuable. It's essential, and it's what organizations are actually fairly good at, right? They still can do work to get clear and be better aligned and make better commitments and create better cultures, but they've gotten a lot better at that. What they've done that's still debilitating them is not looked at this whole area of healing in the subconscious and bringing that forward to support and get in sync with those priorities that they want to generate out there. And that the wet blanket is the lack of awareness of one's subconscious and what's in there and how it's been developed, that can take some time to understand and heal. But we also know there's faster ways to do that we're privy to in that way. And then once you have that activation, once that's with you, then a lot more is possible, and a lot more can be created, and a lot less barriers are in your way. Real business results are going to be affected by this, right? I mean, you're going to be able to move the needle in a massive way than you maybe even didn't think was possible before. Is that fair to say?
Yes. And I think about it. Just you're talking about, okay, one solution that covers such key components of like healing yourself and empowering yourself as a result of your healing, which is really amazing, right? And then, but all of that happens during the process of activating your internal resources, because we all have those internal resources inside of us to deal with that. We don't need to, subject ourselves to some, psychic lobotomy or whatever, whatever they do out there, right? We've got everything inside of us. That's fair to say that a lot of people who say that, we've got all these elements to resolve our internal issues available to us. The trouble is, we can't trigger this whole process by ourselves, by our conscious effort. It just doesn't work like that. It still requires the external, stimuli to set our nervous system and our brains on the path of resetting itself.
Yes.
So that's how it works.
Yeah. Oh, well, whether it's working with, you on a reset or working with somebody that's skilled in healing trauma or whatever, you need somebody outside because you can't look at yourself because it's like a black hole, right? It's you have to have somebody that knows how to pull it up and have you see it in whatever way they do it, and that's essential. And then a question comes down. We can talk about this. We have to have a whole show on the neuro reset. That's what we have to do to talk about what that is, because it's a really important contribution that you've made through this process to be able to free and release people from the barriers. And I've seen it firsthand in my own self and in my clients. So that's to me something to dive into more in another show because we're running out of time today. But again, it goes back to what people have to get about the issue is not external structures, external focus, aligning, prioritizing, better communication, building cultures, all that is essential. I think what we've done in our work in organizations, because those things are known, everybody can point to them, everybody can see them. It's a lot easier to restructure things there. But we really have to talk about restructuring and reorganizing and healing the inside to meet all those new things that we're doing so they can fully be leveraged into creating organizations that, obviously do well and are profitable, but also have an impact in the world by creating greater value in a time when we need that, right? And we have big problems to solve. And right now we're facing that where we have fundamentally a lot of people that are not paying attention to their subconscious, that are running roughshod, doing their best, but we've got the insane running the asylum, kind of right now in many ways. And really all it is human beings that have lost touch with their inner resources and what's possible and their hearts in a certain way, right?
Yes, yes, that's true. I mean, the level of external challenges, for any executive has never been so high. I mean, it's just like it's too much going on. But you also, I want to dwell quickly on this element that, yes, you're right, describing, that playing field, with all the potential solutions and all that. It's also important to know this. For some reason, people developed this idea of entitlement, that they don't need to do any self-work, but just because life is so hard and unfair, it should be delivered to them, on a silver platter, and all the work to be done by them. Because, well, in a way, that sense of entitlement is because, well, our psyche can only handle this much. They can't handle any extras.
Well, that again, it's why should I do? This is the thing. It's the maturity. It's the maturity of our species. Like you got to take responsibility. I heard one guy say this, that you're not responsible for your trauma, for it happening. However, whether you like it or not, you're responsible for healing it. And if you do, and if you don't, what you're saying, if I want to put my hands up and not do that, we're going to get more of the same, and we know where that's going. If we get more of the same that we're getting now, we're in trouble. So really, what this is really calling for is a great kind humanity coming to terms with what you're saying is to do my inner work, because that fundamentally, there's a certain time period where that may not be completely a blast to do. But it's like what we invest in tends to bear fruit. When we're lazy, we don't invest in it, we get more of the same, right? So that's where we're at. But I really appreciate you coming on the show today. And I think our next show needs to be really looking at what we can do to resolve this, and talking to you a little bit about what the reset is and how what you do helps resolve it as one way to which is a simple and a direct way to resolve it. So that we've said that, and I've threatened to do that a couple other times, but this time we're really going to do it and sit down and just make the program about that. So
Yes, thanks for having me, David. I really enjoyed our conversation. We really talk about important issues. So, yeah, I'm looking
Yeah.
forward to having that discussion next time about what the neuro reset does.
Yes, we'll do that. Well, appreciate it. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today on Unfazed Under Fire. We're really attempting to dive into subjects that may be a little bit unwieldy at times, but they're important because they're things we haven't spoken about in the leadership development profession in a profound way, and they need to be spoken about because of where we're at today and what we're facing in the world today, and what the challenges of organizations and leaders in those organizations are facing more and more and more and confronting. There is a solution, and we're working towards trying to also not just name the problem here, but also offer solutions to you that can support you in your effectiveness as an executive. So thank you, Anatoly, for joining us today. Appreciate our conversations, and we will see everybody back here next time on Unfazed Under Fire. Thanks for joining us.